It would normally announce that it's being recorded, but it is recorded now. So over to you, Helen. It's being
Okay.
recorded.
Okay, thank you. So this is going to be a very brief uh, explanation of how PFIs actually work. And I thought I'd start by just comparing it with how you would build a hospital before PFI came along. So, in the good old days, if a hospital needed new buildings or whatever, etc., they could apply for a capital grant from the relevant government department, some form of the Department for Health, who would go to the Treasury. And eventually, if the thing was granted, the government would raise the necessary finance on the bond markets. And governments can generally borrow cheaply in those markets because they are assumed to be relatively risk-free as an investment. That is, they are unlikely to default. And this was the mechanism, building infrastructure through government borrowing, that historically built much of the social infrastructure in Britain, schools or hospitals, government offices, and even it would be the mechanism to provide weapon systems. And some weapon systems these days are actually provided through PFI. But if you want to keep down borrowing, you look around for another way. And since the 1980s, a large objective of governments has been to keep down government deficits and keep borrowing low. And so by using private finance instead, a fundamental change came in the way that infrastructure is paid for. What had been capital expenditure by the central government was transformed into current expenditure by hospitals in the form of debt repayment and interest payments. So investors still got their steady stream of income from their investment, but it was out of the hospital's current expenditure. So I've got a little statement under there. In order to keep infrastructure costs off the books, PFIs have transformed what was capital expenditure by central government into current expenditure by public bodies. In so doing, it created a steady income stream for investors, all of which flows through the special purpose vehicle. And that's the next thing I'm going to explain. And this always happens. Sorry, just let me try again. Yeah, um, so when you develop a hospital with PFI, it's a different process, and I'll just go through that because it helps to explain what goes on. So in the case of QEH, so we have our hospital, our QEH over here. Whoops. The local health authority, I think it must have been, decided that they would transform the old military hospital into an acute NHS hospital. It would have put out a formal request for tender, laying out what they wanted for the new building. And what they wanted is generally referred to as a design, finance, build and operate contract, or DFBO. And that was generally the form that most PFIs took. And when this happened, they would put out a tender for investors, for a group of firms, consortiums, to design, build, finance and operate the hospital. And what you would get then, you would get various firms coming together and forming consortiums. And each consortium would bid for that tender. They would submit their costs and their terms. And from these, one would be chosen. So at the point when the contract was signed, the winning consortium of firms would have set up a special firm, a special purpose vehicle. And I'll talk about what that is in the next slide. Now, originally, the special purpose vehicle, the SPV for the QEH, which is called the Meridian Hospital Company PLC, that was originally owned by an investment company, the main design and building contractor, and the firm or firms intending to operate the building after it was built. Over time, what has happened, and it's another little scandal associated with PFIs, which I won't go into in any detail, but over time, the different people have been bought out. And so over time, one or two investment companies buy out the other members of the consortium. So today, Meridian is owned by Innisfree and Fenton Holdco Limited. And Fenton Holdco, I think, is ultimately owned by Equitix, which is a private equity firm. But 73% of the SPV is owned by Innisfree. And you can find out all about this if you go on Innisfree's website, and I've put in the links there. So that's how the hospital is now developed. It's done through the hospital's discussions with the consortium and signing an agreement as a hospital with a special purpose vehicle. So if we then turn to the PFI contract itself. So let's look at the special purpose vehicle for a minute, first of all. It has no employees. It's what's called a shell company. It's remote from the main owners, from the people who have invested in that SPV. If it goes bankrupt, the owners of the SPV lose their equity, lose their shareholdings, but in no other way are they affected. It doesn't affect them otherwise at all. It's a private company and it's registered at Companies House. But the owners of the SPV, in the case of QEH Innisfree, for instance, might well be registered somewhere else. So ultimately, I know that Innisfree used to be registered in Guernsey, and I think they have now moved. I'm not sure. But many, many investors in PFI are registered in places like Guernsey and Jersey. So the public authority signs this long-term contract with the SPV to design, build, finance and operate the hospital infrastructure. And that little arrow there is supposed to indicate ownership. The public authority, the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in this case, agrees to make regular payments, which are known as the unitary charge, to the SPV for what it does, designing, building, the cost of the interest and the cost of operating the hospital. So go on to the next slide. So the main thing that the special purpose vehicle does is to operate a series of contracts. It's got its main contract with the hospital. That is the main PFI contract. It stipulates everything to do with the contract, how it's, the design, the building, how big it is, how it's going to be operated, what the cost of operating it is, what the cost of the maintenance contracts is, what the cost, all of that is all in that contract. And that contract is usually very, very difficult to get hold of. It's designated for FOI purposes as business in confidence. They then sign a number of other contracts. So they need to, first of all, they need to finance the whole investment. So they sign contracts. Now, in the case of QEH, so they sign contracts, first of all, with the people who are going to supply the bulk of the loans. So 90% of the finance comes from raising bank loans or going on the bond markets. I think in the case of QEH, most of the money was raised through bonds. And that will all have been agreed, and how much money is paid and what the interest rate is will all have been agreed with the special purpose vehicle when the contract was signed. Now that 90% of the finance is charged at what is basically a not too unreasonable rate of interest. It's usually something like the bank rate plus 1%, or it might be LIBOR, if you remember that term, the London interbanking offer rate, it doesn't matter, plus 1%. It's usually something around that. That might be 4%, 5%, 6%, depending on the time at which the contract was actually signed. So that's 90% of the finance. And I'm going to talk about the other 10% in a minute. The other agreement the special purpose vehicle signs is obviously with the person who's contracted, the firm that's contracted to actually design and build the hospital itself. And the final contract it signed is with the people who are going to operate the building. Now that has two parts to it. There's the operation in the terms of maintenance, and that's called hard facilities management, and services such as cleaning, and these services are called soft facilities management. At QEH, about 10 years ago now, I think, maybe less, they took the soft facilities management out of the contract, so it's no longer in it. For the Riverside building at Lewisham, that part of the contract is still in. Yes, so all of the monies owed to these people, it's all part of the unitary payment that the hospital must pay to the special purpose vehicle in a monthly unitary charge. But to look a little bit more about this 10%, what is that 10% of finance that is not covered by bank loans or the bond markets? And for that, we have to go back and look again at the people who own the special purpose vehicle, this investor consortium. In the case of QEH, that investor consortium consists of two firms, Innisfree and this other smaller investor. In the case of Ravensbourne, there's just one firm, which is HICL Limited, which used to be called HSBC Investment Consortium Limited. But anyway, these are the investors. So they own the SPV. They have contributed shares, or what is called equity, into the SPV. In addition, they put up the other 10% of the loan, of the finance needed to actually build and provide the infrastructure and operate the infrastructure. So what do they receive from the SPV? And it's really what these people receive from the SPV that I focused on, that's really where the big money lies. First of all, because they own shares in the SPV, they're entitled to receive dividends on those shares. And those shares come out of the profits that the SPV makes. In the early days, often the SPVs did not make a profit because they were having to pay all the fees to the contractors, and that would often put them into some sort of a deficit. Once the construction period ended, the SPVs began to make more and more profits. So those profits could be quite high. The other thing is that because they lend 10% of the finance, they get an interest rate, and it's that interest rate charged on the loan provided by the investor consortium, which is really high. In the case of QEH, the interest on the loan is charged at 15%. In the case of the Riverside building, the interest is charged at 10%. Okay, we're coming up to the final bit. So when you turn to the page of the website, and I've got it here, of our website, I've got up there my most recent calculations concerning the profits, the dividends, and the interest payments made to the investors in these two PFIs. And you can see here the figure. And because I keep on rounding up, I come up to different figures here. But anyway, 12.3 million in pre-tax profits in 2024-2025, but a total, since the start of the project, of 173.9 million in profits. The dividends the shareholders received in 2024 to 25 was 2.6 million, but over the course of the whole contract so far, it's 56.5 million. And the interest on the loans that the shareholders have received since it all started, 45 million. In 2024 to 2025, 1 million. Now, the thing is about this, I'll just say this briefly. What they decide to take in dividends, and even what they decide to, how much interest they decide to take, varies from year to year. And actually, that 1 million is quite low for the year. But the 1.5 million that Ravensbourne took out in dividends in last year, 2024 to 25, is actually rather high. So so it it's a high. It's even higher than Meridian, and this is because they were taking more dividends out. And that's another complication, but I won't explain that now. So if you wanted to see where I get at least some of these figures from, this is the accounts for 2024-25, the Meridian Hospital Company PLC. And you can see here, I've got the profit before taxation. I could have taken the profit after taxation. Some people do, some people don't. I decided to take the profit before taxation simply because that gives you an idea of the overall size of profits being made. Because yeah, and it's also the amount taken by the Centre for Health and Public Interest, and some of they do some of the major work on this, and that's a figure they take. So I followed their system. That's the end of the presentation. If there are questions, I'm happy to take them. I'm going to stop sharing now. Is that okay, Dave, when we stop the
It's fine.
presentation?
Yep. You want me to stop recording?
I think so.
Okay, I'm going to stop recording now.